It was one of those classic stormy Thursday nights, the kind that makes you want to stay inside, wrapped in a blanket, with nothing but the sound of rain against the windows. The house was unusually quiet, mostly because Jason, the roommate, was out of town for a few days visiting his family. Ryan had the place all to himself, which wasn't something he minded. In fact, he had been looking forward to some alone time. No distractions, no noise, just him, the couch, and his phone. He stretched out, scrolling through Instagram mindlessly as the rain continued to pour outside. The wind howled every now and then, but it wasn't anything unusual for this time of year. Ryan barely noticed it, too caught up in the glow of his phone screen. That's when the lights flickered. It was just a quick flash, barely lasting a second, but enough to grab his attention. He glanced up, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for the lights to flicker again, but everything stayed on. With a shrug, he went back to scrolling, chalking it up to the storm outside. It wasn't uncommon for the power to act up during bad weather. But a few minutes later, the entire house plunged into darkness. The power had gone out completely. Ryan let out a groan, immediately reaching for his phone, using it as a makeshift flashlight. "Great," he muttered to himself. "Just what I needed." Sitting in pitch-black silence wasn't an option, so Ryan knew what he had to do. He sighed and reluctantly got up from the couch, still holding his phone in front of him like a torch. The only thing that came to mind was the breaker box down in the basement. Of course, it had to be the basement, the part of the house that always felt creepy, especially in the dark. He muttered a curse under his breath, already dreading the walk down there. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the basement door. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The wind outside, the rain tapping on the windows, his own footsteps. All of it made the house feel alive somehow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though he knew he was alone. Ryan reached the basement door and hesitated for a moment, feeling a slight chill run down his spine. He shook his head, pushing the feeling aside. "Come on, it's just the dark," he told himself, trying to laugh it off. He pulled open the door and descended the stairs, the light from his phone barely cutting through the thick darkness that surrounded him. The basement was cold, the air heavy and damp. Each step echoed, making the entire experience feel even more unsettling than it needed to be. When he finally reached the bottom, the breaker box loomed in front of him. Ryan opened the panel, expecting to find one of the switches flipped, but when he checked, everything looked perfectly normal. No blown fuses, no trip breakers. It was all fine. He frowned, confusion settling in. If the breaker was fine, then why was the power out? He stood there for a moment, staring at the panel, trying to make sense of it. That's when a strange thought crossed his mind. What if it wasn't the storm that knocked out the power? Ryan was about to close the breaker box, his mind still spinning from the confusion of why everything seemed fine, but the power was out. As he turned to head back upstairs, a noise stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, straining his ears to listen. The sound came again, soft but unmistakable. It was coming from above him. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking across the floor above him, moving with a cautious, almost eerie rhythm. His heart raced in his chest. The logical part of his brain immediately tried to rationalize it. It's just the house settling. Maybe the wind pushing against the walls. He knew older houses could make strange noises, especially during storms. He wanted to believe that was all it was, but deep down, something about the sound felt off. The footsteps weren't random creaks or groans from the wood. They were steady, as if someone was walking with purpose. The kind of sound that could only be made by someone or something. Ryan stayed frozen in the basement, his eyes darting toward the ceiling as if he could somehow see through it. His phone, which he had been using as a flashlight, started to shake slightly in his hand. He could feel the panic starting to creep in, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Is someone in the house? Did they get in while I was downstairs? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. No, that's impossible. I'm just imagining things. But the footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above his head. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was up there. Ryan's heart pounded harder, his throat dry. He had two choices. He could stay frozen in the basement, or he could go upstairs and face whatever was making that sound. Neither option felt particularly appealing. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan finally mustered up the courage to move. He tightened his grip on his phone and slowly began to ascend the stairs, his footsteps barely making a sound. Every creak of the wooden steps sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. He reached the top of the stairs, standing in the doorway between the basement and the rest of the house. The house was silent now. No footsteps, no creaking floors, just the soft patter of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. For a moment, he stood there, phone light illuminating the hallway, his breath shallow and shaky. Ryan swallowed hard and slowly walked through the house, checking each room one by one. The living room was empty, the kitchen untouched. He moved down the hallway, glancing into each room, his heart still racing. The further he went, the more certain he became that there was no one there. He checked the bathroom, the closets, even under the furniture, but everything was exactly how he left it. The house was empty, or at least it looked that way. Despite the quiet, the unsettling feeling remained. Ryan couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right, that he wasn't truly alone. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise louder. He double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, trying to reassure himself that everything was secure. But in the back of his mind, the sound of those footsteps echoed, gnawing at him. He sat down on the couch, his hands still trembling, phone clutched tightly. The house was empty, but why then did it feel like he was being watched? Ryan tried to shake off the unsettling feeling crawling up his spine. The footsteps, the silence, the storm, it was all messing with his head. It's just your imagination, he told himself, pacing around the living room, checking the windows. Each lock clicked into place with a solid thunk as he double-checked them. He moved from window to window, then to the front door, making sure everything was sealed tight. But no matter how many times he checked, the tension in his chest didn't ease. It felt like the walls were closing in on him, the quiet of the house almost too loud now. His heart raced with every tiny sound, each creak of the old house, making his mind spiral into paranoia. After securing every door and window, he plopped back onto the couch, gripping his phone in one hand, trying to focus on the screen to distract himself. He forced a deep breath, leaning back and telling himself everything was fine. You're just being paranoid. Houses make noises. It's nothing, he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself that there wasn't anything lurking in the shadows. But then, like a cold shock to his system, it hit him. The back door. His eyes snapped wide open, and his body tensed. He hadn't checked it when he came home earlier. He never locked it. His heart started pounding all over again as the thought sank in. He had been in the house for hours, sure that the door was open. But now, without wasting another second, Ryan bolted from the couch, his phone still casting an eerie glow as he made his way through the darkened house. His footsteps were fast and quiet, his breathing shallow. When he reached the kitchen, he froze, staring at the back door. It was locked. A cold chill ran down his spine as he stared at the bolt, neatly secured in place. He stood there, frozen, his mind racing. He never locked it. He knew he hadn't locked it. He replayed the moment he walked into the house earlier that evening, rain pouring behind him. He had rushed in, dropped his bag by the door, and left it unlocked. But now it was locked. For a split second, Ryan questioned himself. Maybe he had locked it and just forgotten? Maybe, in his rush to settle down, he'd done it without thinking? But as much as he tried to convince himself, deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He felt it in his gut. He stepped closer to the door, cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. He stared at the lock, his hand reaching out to touch it, as if expecting it to somehow explain itself. But it remained silent, cold, and unmoving. Who locked the door? The question lingered in his mind, taunting him. He felt a lump forming in his throat, his body stiff with tension. The fear he had been trying to suppress all night surged back, stronger than before. Without thinking, Ryan rushed to the kitchen drawer, fumbling for something, anything that could make him feel safer. His hand landed on a kitchen knife, and he gripped it tightly, the cold steel grounding him, but doing little to calm the storm of panic inside him. Armed with the knife, he moved through the house again, checking every corner, every shadowy space. The rooms were empty, just as they were before, but the silence in the house felt heavier, suffocating. He searched everywhere, convinced he'd missed something, but every room, every closet, every dark corner revealed nothing. No sign of anyone. No sign that someone had been there. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. That gnawing sensation that something was off. It clung to him, sinking deeper with each passing second. Ryan stood in the middle of the kitchen, gripping the knife, breathing heavily. The back door was locked, and he had no explanation for it. There was no logical reason for any of this, but that didn't make him feel any better. The fear had settled in now, wrapping around him like a fog. He knew he wasn't imagining things. Something wasn't right. But what? He tried to push the thoughts away, to convince himself that he was just jumping at shadows. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the creeping feeling that he wasn't alone in the house after all. The hours dragged on as the storm outside raged even harder. The rain slammed against the windows like a relentless drumbeat, and the wind howled, squeezing through the tiny cracks in the house, making the old wooden frames groan. The power was still out, leaving Ryan in an unsettling mix of shadows and the cold glow from his phone's flashlight. Despite everything that had happened earlier, the rhythmic sound of the storm was beginning to have a calming effect. The adrenaline from his earlier scare had worn off, and he was starting to convince himself that maybe he had been overreacting. The footsteps, the locked door, it was all just his imagination, right? The storm, the dark, it had all played tricks on his mind. Sitting on the couch again, Ryan took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in the normalcy of it all. Sure, the power outage was annoying, but it wasn't like it was the first time he'd experienced something like this. He told himself that when the storm passed, everything would go back to normal. He just needed to make it through the night. But just as he started to relax, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another shadow cast by the flickering light from his phone. But no, his body tensed immediately. There outside the living room window, something moved. His heart skipped a beat. He tried to focus, to see more clearly through the rain-blurred glass, but for a moment, everything seemed still again. The wind rattled the window. The rain streaked down in heavy sheets, but nothing seemed out of place. Ryan let out a shaky breath, his muscles slowly relaxing, until he saw it. A face. There, pressed up against the glass, just for a split second, was the unmistakable outline of a face. Pale, emotionless, staring directly at him from the other side of the window. The image burned into his mind. It wasn't close enough to make out any details, but there was no mistaking it. It was there, watching him. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. He scrambled back, nearly dropping his phone, his wide eyes locked on the window. But there was nothing now. Just the rain and the darkness outside. For a moment, he sat frozen on the couch, unable to move, unable to think clearly. His mind raced. Did I really just see that? He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination again. The storm, the darkness, it had to be messing with him. But deep down, he knew what he saw. His hands trembled as he fumbled to unlock his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He quickly found Jason's number and dialed, praying that his roommate would answer, even though he knew Jason was hours away, probably still with family. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, no answer. Ryan cursed under his breath and tried again. Still no luck. He sat there, phone clutched tightly in his hand, debating what to do next. Should he call the police? But what would he even say? I think I saw someone outside. It sounded ridiculous. They'd think he was paranoid, imagining things because of the storm. But that face, it was so real. He couldn't just ignore it. Ryan stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, and walked slowly toward the window, knife still in his other hand. He hesitated for a moment, half expecting to see the face again, but all that greeted him was the swirling darkness and the pounding rain. He pressed his face closer to the glass, peering outside, but there was nothing. Just the backyard, drenched in rain, the trees swaying wildly in the wind. But the image of that face was still burned into his mind. He pulled back from the window, his chest heaving with each breath. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, he thought. Or maybe the storm playing tricks on me again. But the fear gnawing at his gut told him otherwise. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching him, waiting. With shaky hands, Ryan backed away from the window and quickly made his way to the kitchen. Every instinct in his body screaming at him to do something, anything, to protect himself. He checked the back door again, still locked. He tried to think clearly, but his thoughts were racing too fast. He moved back toward the living room, phone in hand, fingers hovering over the emergency call button. He hesitated, the rain still pounding on the windows, his mind battling between fear and reason. What if it was nothing? What if he was just imagining it all? But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. And whatever it was out there, somewhere in the storm, just beyond the thin glass of his window. Ryan's pulse was still racing from the face at the window. He sat on the edge of the couch, clutching the knife in one hand and his phone in the other. His mind was a blur of thoughts, his ears hyper-aware of every little creak, every gust of wind howling outside. His eyes darted around the room, from window to window, as though expecting that pale face to reappear at any moment. Just as he was about to put his phone down, it rang. The sudden sound pierced the tense silence, making him jump so hard that he nearly dropped the phone onto the floor. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart felt like it was about to leap out of his chest. He glanced at the screen, hoping it was Jason calling back. But the number was unknown. For a split second, he hesitated. It was probably nothing, a wrong number. But in the state he was in, with the tension and fear swirling around him, every little thing felt significant. Every small detail felt like it could be a clue. His thumb hovered over the answer button, his mind racing. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could hear the shakiness in his own tone. There was no reply, only silence on the other end of the line. Ryan felt his throat tighten as he pressed the phone closer to his ear, straining to hear anything that would explain the call. And then, faintly, he heard it, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. Whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't speaking, just breathing in a way that sent chills down Ryan's spine. Each breath was deliberate, deep, as if the person was standing just a few feet away from him, watching, listening. His heart slammed against his ribs as the realization sank in. This wasn't a random call. Whoever this was, they knew. They were toying with him. Panic surged through him, and without thinking, he hung up, his hands shaking violently. He fumbled with the phone, desperately blocking the number. His chest heaved as he stared at the screen, his mind trying to process what had just happened. Was it connected to the face he saw, or had it just been some sick coincidence? Ryan sat there, knife still clutched tightly in his hand, knuckles white from gripping it so hard. His body felt frozen, muscles tensed with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The storm outside roared louder than ever, but it was the eerie quiet inside the house that scared him the most. The only sound was the faint ringing in his ears from the silence on the phone. Minutes ticked by. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the shadows lengthening, the flickering light from his phone casting strange shapes on the walls. He kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the face again, lurking just beyond the glass. Suddenly, the phone rang again. The sharp tone sliced through the silence, louder than before. Ryan's stomach twisted in knots as he looked down at the screen. The same unknown number flashed across the display. His heart pounded as his mind raced. He couldn't bring himself to answer again. Not after the breathing. Not after the feeling that whoever had called was somehow there, with him, watching. He let it ring out, every chime of the phone making his nerves jangle, his body locked in place as he stared at it. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The air felt thick with tension, almost suffocating. Ryan could feel it, the unsettling sensation of being watched. It was as though invisible eyes were locked onto him, waiting for his next move. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Still, the weight of that feeling pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He stood up slowly, every nerve in his body on edge, and walked to the window. He peeked outside, trying to see through the rain-soaked glass, but the backyard was dark, shrouded in shadows. There was no movement, no sign of anyone, but that didn't bring him any comfort. He could feel it, something was out there. Ryan backed away from the window, his hand gripping the knife even tighter. His phone sat on the couch, the screen dark now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The ringing, the breathing, it wasn't over, and whoever was on the other end wasn't done with him. As he stood there, knife in hand, waiting for the next ring, the wind outside howled and the storm surged on. But inside the house, the real storm was only just beginning. Time crawled by in agonizing slowness. Ryan sat motionless on the couch, the knife never leaving his grip. His phone lay beside him, dark and silent after the last eerie call, but the feeling of being watched still clung to him like a second skin. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, rain pounding the windows, thunder rumbling ominously in the distance. It felt like the whole world was pressing down on him, the weight of the darkness too heavy to ignore. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since the last call. Minutes? Hours? The ticking clock on the wall had lost all meaning in the suffocating tension. Ryan's eyes flicked toward the phone every few seconds, half expecting it to ring again, bringing more heavy breathing or some other twisted prank. He tried to focus on anything else, but his thoughts kept circling back to one question. What was happening? Just as he began to think maybe it was over, his phone buzzed. Ryan flinched so hard he almost dropped the knife. His heart raced as he reached for the phone, fingers trembling slightly as he swiped the screen to check the notification. It was a text message. The number was unknown. Ryan's stomach dropped as he opened the message. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes scanned the words on the screen. Simple but chilling. I'm in the house. The world seemed to freeze around him. The blood drained from his face, and a cold wave of fear crashed over him, making every hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His mind reeled, trying to process what he was seeing. It felt like a sick joke, something out of a nightmare. But the words were there, clear and undeniable, staring back at him from the glowing screen. I'm in the house. His throat tightened as panic took hold. His hands were slick with sweat, making it hard to keep a grip on the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he typed back, desperate for answers, though he wasn't sure he wanted them. Who is this? He typed, his hands shaking as he hit send. The message was delivered, but there was no response. Ryan stared at the screen, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts, waiting for the three little dots that would indicate the person was typing. But nothing came, just the silence. He checked the time on the text. It had been sent only moments ago, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since. Ryan's mind raced. What should he do? Call the police? Run out into the storm? Every option felt like a dead end. The police wouldn't get there fast enough, and the thought of running into the pouring rain with someone possibly inside the house, lurking in the shadows, terrified him even more. He glanced around the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The house felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak more menacing. His paranoia was spiraling out of control, but the message on his phone was real. Someone was playing with him, toying with his fear. He opened a new message, his fingers barely able to type. "Where are you?" he sent, his heart in his throat. As he waited for a response, his mind jumped to every horrible possibility. Was this someone he knew? Was it Jason messing with him? But that didn't make sense. Jason was still hours away. And the face at the window, it hadn't been Jason. He knew that much. Suddenly, from the living room, he heard a sound. A small, unmistakable creak. Ryan froze, his blood running cold. The noise was faint but distinct, the kind of sound wood makes when it's pressed down by weight. Someone or something was there, inside the house. His chest tightened as he held his breath, listening intently. The storm raged outside, but the creak had come from within. He knew the house well, knew every sound it made. This wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the house settling. Someone was moving. The phone slipped from his hand, landing on the couch with a soft thud. For a moment, he considered calling 911, but he hesitated. What would he even say? That someone had texted him from inside the house? That he heard a noise? It felt unreal, like he was trapped in some horror movie where the protagonist always made the wrong decision. His fingers twitched, itching to move, to do something. He gripped the knife even tighter, trying to steady his racing heart. But his thoughts were too scattered, his mind screaming at him to run. Yet he couldn't move, rooted to the spot by fear. The house was so quiet now, the only sounds coming from the storm outside. The creak hadn't come again, but Ryan knew he wasn't imagining it. He could feel it, the presence in the room, the weight of eyes watching him from somewhere in the dark. Slowly, he stood, his legs trembling as he stepped away from the couch. His ears were on high alert, every little noise sending jolts of adrenaline through his body. The phone buzzed again, and Ryan's stomach churned. Another text, but he didn't dare look. Instead, he edged toward the doorway, his eyes darting around the room, trying to catch sight of any movement in the shadows. As he approached the hallway, the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. The fear gnawed at him, the knowledge that someone else was there, just out of sight. He didn't know where they were hiding, but he knew they were close. Too close. With the knife in one hand and his phone buzzing in the other, Ryan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped forward into the unknown. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward the living room, the knot of dread tightening in his stomach with every step. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, the house feeling like it was closing in around him. The message, the creak in the other room, it all blended together into a rising wave of terror that he couldn't escape. His only thought was to find the source of the noise, to prove to himself that it was nothing. But when he reached the living room, he stopped dead in his tracks. One of the windows was wide open. For a second, Ryan just stared, trying to process what he was seeing. The curtains, which had been neatly drawn just moments ago, were now flapping wildly in the wind, sending cool gusts of rain-sprinkled air into the room. The storm outside seemed to scream through the opening, filling the space with the chaotic sounds of wind and rain. The room felt colder, darker, as if the open window had invited something unwanted inside. How did I miss that? He thought, his mind scrambling for answers. He had checked the house, locked every door, every window. Hadn't he? He replayed the moments in his head, trying to remember if he had locked that specific window. But with everything that had happened, the phone calls, the face in the window, the messages, it was all becoming a blur. The window had been closed earlier. He was sure of it. He had checked the locks, gone through the motions, making sure everything was secure. So, how was it open now? Ryan stepped closer, the knife still clutched tightly in his hand, his body tense with fear. Every muscle was coiled, ready for whatever might happen next. The curtain snapped back and forth like something alive, twisting in the wind as the storm howled outside. He moved cautiously toward the window, his heart racing in his chest, every instinct screaming that something wasn't right. That's when he heard it, a creak behind him. He spun around, knife raised, eyes wide and searching the room, but there was nothing. No one, just the darkened house, the same familiar furniture, the same suffocating silence. His pulse thudded in his ears, the room swimming in and out of focus as he scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. But it was empty. Ryan stood frozen, his breath shallow, eyes darting around the room, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling again. It's the storm, he told himself. The wind, the old wooden floors creaking. Nothing more, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. That gnawing, gut-wrenching sensation that he wasn't alone. That someone or something was watching him, hiding just out of sight. His mind raced, fighting to keep control, but panic was setting in. Desperate to regain some sense of control, Ryan turned back toward the window. The wind was relentless, pushing the curtains in and out of the room like ghostly arms reaching toward him. He rushed forward, hands trembling, and grabbed the window frame, slamming it shut with a loud bang. He quickly locked it, his fingers fumbling with the latch as he forced it closed, sealing the room from the storm outside. He stepped back, the room now eerily quiet, save for the muted rumble of thunder in the distance. The cold air lingered in the room, a reminder of how close the outside world had come. But as he stood there, staring at the now closed window, the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse. How did the window open? Ryan's mind struggled to make sense of it. Had he forgotten to lock it after all? Or had something, opened it? The thought made his skin crawl. He hadn't heard anyone enter the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass. Just the open window and the storm. But then he remembered the text. "I'm in the house." The message replayed in his mind over and over again. The words sinking in deeper now, becoming more real. If someone was truly inside, how long had they been there? And why hadn't he seen them yet? A sense of dread washed over him, so strong it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He backed away from the window, glancing over his shoulder again, feeling more paranoid than ever. His imagination was running wild, filling the shadows with unseen dangers. Every creak and gust of wind a potential threat. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The house was quiet again, but that didn't make him feel any safer. Every instinct told him that something was still off, that the danger hadn't passed. He checked the window one last time, making sure the lock was secure before slowly retreating into the hallway. But as he moved away from the living room, leaving the now closed window behind, the question still echoed in his mind. How did it open? He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was lurking somewhere nearby, hidden in the shadows, waiting for him to let his guard down. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. Ryan's head felt like it was spinning, his thoughts tangled in a haze of fear and confusion. The constant tension, the unanswered questions, the creeping sense of dread. It was all too much. His heart hadn't stopped racing since the window, and now he could feel panic creeping up the back of his neck like cold fingers. He needed a moment, just a second to clear his head, to convince himself that he wasn't losing his mind. Feeling suffocated, he headed to the bathroom. The small space felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the storm raging both outside and in his mind. He closed the door behind him, trying to shut out the unsettling feeling that had settled over the entire house. The only sound now was the steady patter of rain against the window, muffled by the walls, and his own shaky breathing. Ryan leaned over the sink, gripping the edges of the cold porcelain to steady himself. His reflection stared back at him from the bathroom mirror, pale and wide-eyed. He barely recognized himself in the dim glow of his phone's light, which he had placed on the counter. His face was drawn, his eyes rimmed with fear. What the hell is happening? He thought, desperately trying to make sense of it all. He turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on his face, the sharp chill offering a momentary relief from the swirling thoughts. As the droplets ran down his skin, he kept his head low, taking deep breaths, willing his heart to slow down. It's just stress. It's the storm, the calls, the window. It's all getting to you. He closed his eyes, gripping the sink tighter, his knuckles white. When he finally lifted his head to look at himself in the mirror again, something else caught his attention, something behind him. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the reflection. Standing in the hallway, just visible in the dim light, was the figure of a person, a shadowy silhouette, unmoving, standing just beyond the bathroom door. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as icy terror flooded his veins. For a split second, his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. But there it was clear as day, a figure standing there, watching him. Ryan's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He wanted to scream, to move, but his body was paralyzed, locked in place by fear. His eyes stayed glued to the mirror, not daring to look away. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face what was standing behind him. His mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it's a trick of the light. Maybe it's your imagination. Maybe you're hallucinating. But none of those thoughts could push away the stark reality of what he was seeing. For what felt like an eternity, neither he nor the figure moved. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the bathroom suddenly feeling much colder. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a dark shadow that seemed to fill the entire hallway behind him. Ryan's hand tightened around the sink, his knuckles turning even whiter. Then, with a rush of courage, or maybe sheer panic, he spun around. The hallway was empty. Ryan's chest heaved, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stood there, staring into the darkened hallway. The light from his phone barely illuminated the edges of the walls, casting long shadows, but there was no one there. No figure, no silhouette, just the empty space stretching out before him, leading back into the rest of the house. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to calm his racing heart. His mind was in overdrive, struggling to process what had just happened. Did I really see that? It had been so clear, so real, but now, standing in the doorway, there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet house, the storm still howling outside. Ryan stepped into the hallway, his body still trembling with adrenaline, and scanned the space again. Nothing. He moved cautiously, as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment, but every corner was empty. The fear gnawed at him, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. He slowly returned to the bathroom, his reflection in the mirror now looking even more frightened, more worn. His pulse still pounded in his ears, and his thoughts raced faster than he could keep up with. Am I going crazy? The thought crossed his mind, and for a moment it felt all too real. The strange noises, the open window, the phone calls, the face in the window, and now this. It all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Ryan stood in front of the mirror, still gripping the sink, his eyes searching his reflection for some sort of answer. But there was nothing, no explanation, no reason for what was happening. Only silence. He checked the hallway again, the knife still in his hand, as if expecting the shadowy figure to suddenly materialize once more. But it was still empty. Feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down on him, he made a decision. The only thing left to do now was retreat to his bedroom. He needed to lock himself in, barricade the door, and wait out the storm, both outside and inside the house. Morning felt like a distant, unreachable goal, but it was all he had left to hold on to. With shaky hands, Ryan stepped out of the bathroom, his mind still swirling with doubt and fear, and made his way down the hallway. The bedroom door loomed ahead like a final refuge, the last place where he might find some semblance of safety. But as he reached for the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for him to let his guard down. Ryan stumbled into his bedroom, his mind still swirling with fear, confusion, and exhaustion. His legs felt heavy, his entire body buzzing with adrenaline, but the terror that had gripped him all night had left him on the edge of collapse. The moment he stepped inside, he moved quickly, dragging a chair over to the door and wedging it under the handle, creating a makeshift barricade. It wasn't much, but it gave him a small sense of control, a fragile barrier between him and whatever might be lurking in the house. With the door blocked, he backed into the farthest corner of the room, sinking down onto the floor, the knife still clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes never left the door. He sat there, staring at it, waiting for something, anything to happen. Every sound from the house, every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind outside, made his heart race. The storm outside still howled, but it was the silence inside the house that unnerved him the most. Time dragged on. Minutes felt like hours, the dark, suffocating quiet pressing down on him. He didn't dare close his eyes, didn't dare let his guard down, but exhaustion weighed on him like a heavy blanket. His eyelids fluttered, and at some point, despite his best efforts to stay alert, he drifted off into an uneasy sleep. When he woke up, the room was bathed in the soft glow of morning light. Ryan blinked, disoriented at first, as he tried to piece together what had happened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the night. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. The distant chirping of birds replaced the howling wind, and the rain had stopped entirely. The house was quiet, too quiet. He glanced at the door, still blocked by the chair, and slowly rose to his feet. His body ached from the tension and the uncomfortable position he'd slept in, but more than that, his mind was still buzzing with the events of the night. The face in the window, the phone calls, the figure in the mirror, it all felt like a bad dream, but it had been so real. The text message, "I'm in the house." He couldn't forget that. Taking a deep breath, Ryan cautiously moved the chair away from the door, listening intently for any sign of movement outside his room. The house was unnervingly still. Knife still in hand, he slowly turned the knob and opened the door. His heart pounded as he stepped into the hallway, every sense on high alert. As he made his way through the house, everything seemed normal. The living room was exactly as he had left it, though a bit of a mess from his frantic search the night before. The windows were all closed and locked, the curtains still hanging limply in place. No strange noises, no faces peering in. The eerie feeling that had hung over the house seemed to have lifted with the passing of the storm. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the basement door, but there was no sign that anyone else had been there. It was just him, alone. Just as he started to feel a small sense of relief creeping in, he heard the sound of keys jingling at the front door. Ryan froze, his stomach knotting as the door unlocked and swung open. His grip on the knife tightened, but before he could react, Jason walked in, looking confused. "Dude, why is the house a mess?" Jason asked, his brow furrowed as he took in the scene before him. Ryan's heart stuttered in his chest. He stared at Jason for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. His roommate Jason. He was home, safe, real. The tension in Ryan's body began to ease, replaced by a flood of disbelief and relief. "You," Ryan started, his voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. "You're back." Jason shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. "Yeah, came home last night. I was trying to be quiet since I thought you were asleep. Then the storm hit and the power went out. I thought you were wandering around, so I just stayed in my room." He paused, looking at Ryan with concern. "What happened? Why are you holding a knife?" Ryan stared at him, the pieces finally starting to click into place. The footsteps, the noises, the open window. It had been Jason the whole time. He had come home early, and in the darkness, with the storm raging, they had both been creeping around the house, thinking they were alone. The locked back door, the strange sounds, it all made sense now. They had been scaring each other without even realizing it. A shaky laugh escaped Ryan's lips, the tension draining from his body. "Oh man." He ran a hand through his hair, feeling ridiculous. "I thought." He shook his head, laughing again, though there was still an edge of disbelief. "I thought someone was in the house. I didn't know you were back." Jason gave him a quizzical look. "I'm guessing the storm messed with your head. I told you this place feels creepy in the dark." Ryan smiled, but deep down, a lingering unease remained. The explanation seemed so simple now, so logical. But as he replayed the events in his mind, one thing still gnawed at him. The face in the window, the text message. He hadn't imagined those things. And the figure in the mirror, that had felt too real to dismiss as paranoia. He forced himself to brush it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, fueled by the storm and the power outage. But as Jason went about unpacking, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't imagined everything. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of the house, it still felt like something had been watching.